What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the ARC podcast. On this week's episode, we had special guest Drew Hopper come on. Drew is a performance coach at Performance Juice Elite Coaching. He talks about his journey through his life, how he went from being a college wrestler, went into the military, then goes into going from the military back to his civilian life, and kind of everything in between that led for him to become a performance coach and working with athletes, whether it be in golf or jiu-jitsu or any other realms of sport that we see. He also discusses with us his 4 quadrants of golf performance philosophy. We have some good back and forth conversations about how to implement that into some other sports, and definitely go over a lot of cool stories that Drew has from his experiences both in performance coaching and his personal life and military life. So very appreciative for this interview. Definitely some cool insights we have here. So thank you for listening, and please enjoy the episode. What's up, Drew? Welcome. Thanks for coming on the ARC podcast. How's it going, man?
Very good. Glad to be here. Appreciate you guys having me.
Of course. We're excited to get into some conversations. I think this episode's going to be unique compared to some of the other ones. We kind of have a different demographic and realm of where we want to go into. So, Drew, you can go into introducing yourself and letting everyone know kind of how you got into performance coaching and your background and history with that.
Yeah, so Drew Hopper, how I got into performance coaching. Well, probably starts when I started wrestling in high school. My dad's a Green Beret, so I was raised in a pretty rigorous and disciplined environment. A lot of goal setting, a lot of expectations about performance, and so it's kind of almost bred to be a performance coach, literally. And then I went on to wrestle in college, and went on to be an Army officer, which I was an infantry officer, and so really as an infantry officer, you're an athlete. You're a professional athlete. You're just doing it in service to your country. So I did that for a while. After my time, I separated. I got into the med device space and kept one foot in athletics. Really was transitioning more from a wrestling focus to a judo focus. Still continue to participate in judo and jiu-jitsu. I'm a 4th degree black belt in judo and a purple belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So still continue to do that even later in life. Still very much an athlete and a competitive golfer as well on top of it. So had a really successful professional commercial career. Have really transitioned into performance coaching, and how I got into it really as far as the continuation. My initial interest after coaching high school wrestling teams and things like this was to help my kids be the best possible athletes they could be. I have 3 sons, and I know that raising an athlete and a high caliber athlete can kind of be a bit of a science experiment, right? Because you're kind of trial and error and a lot of stuff to see what gets the best possible result. And your kids are extra special because they don't particularly respond well to parents. So if you can be effective as a performance coach as a parent, you might argue that you could get through to a client a little bit easier because they're more receptive to your ideas. So I'd say that was the genesis. My oldest son is now a scholarship college golfer, and so to some degree, mission accomplished. Everybody who's listening that has kids going to college or have been through college, you know what I'm talking about. So, just kind of in that transition phase, though, I realized I wanted to make a bigger impact and expand into my community. And, my wife honestly encouraged me and said, you're kind of different. You're just naturally performance oriented, and not a lot of people just naturally think and show up in life how you do. So I kind of extended that, and I kind of bridged through this and glazed over it. But in my corporate career, the transition from the military as an officer into the corporate world, I went to SMU and earned my MBA. And a lot of my success from a leadership perspective, even though I had the military training, is in thanks to what is just an outstanding business school and the Cox School of Business. So shout out to SMU and the Cox School of Business as well. And really, that's where the elite standards really started to go. So you've got this special forces guy who raises me. Then I go and be a college athlete, then a military officer in 10th Mountain Division, which is a light infantry unit that's pretty badass. So kind of the eliteness was just sort of woven into the DNA of my life, and so it's natural for me to, in this phase of my life in performance coaching, we'd say I'm in the tunnel. I'm moving from prince to king, and I know that. And so I'm happy to be moving to king, and knowing that I'm moving into a position to share my gifts with my community and help them reach levels of performance they wouldn't otherwise.
That's awesome, Drew. Thanks for sharing all that, because that's a cool background and very unique. I'm sure a lot of people didn't have the same journey as that, so that'll be cool to hear. But as far as going from college into the military right after college, can you kind of go into, one, what led that decision, and then just thinking from my personal college experience, going from college and then jumping right into the military, that would be like a complete 360 as to the way I was living and then the way that you go live after that.
Yeah, so I chose to go the path, which is kind of a unique path as well, of going to what is in Ohio, a prestigious academic university. And I was lucky enough to earn an ROTC scholarship to that university. And because of that, I didn't need to worry about the athletic scholarship because it was taken care of with the military. And so I went to a university at the time, had a top 10 ranked Division III wrestling program. And so I always knew that once I earned that scholarship, I was committed to at least 4 years of service, plus the stuff that comes after. It's just happenstance that my commission becoming an officer was immediately after 9/11, and so it was unusual circumstances for me to be entering the armed forces in probably the most historic moment, in U.S. history, or one of.
Yeah.
And so I guess it was just, if you remember that time, it was just sort of we as a country rallied, and we moved in a positive direction. And we I think for me, transitioning from athletics to serving alongside heroes, quite frankly, it was a pretty easy transition because of my athletic background.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. So now, I didn't even know the context of that either, where that was the time period. But now, going from your perspective, again, same thing, coming from college and then going into a time that was in such uncharted waters. Everything was so kind of unknown, and like you said, there was a big rallying cry from our country. How did you approach that mentally, and was there fear on your end? How do you? I think just because I have no military background, no real, I guess, visual on that. How was your mental side going into that? What were you feeling? What were you thinking? How do you approach that?
I mean, the Army does a great job of preparing you. Infantry school is very challenging. Ranger school is very challenging. Airborne school is challenging. So, by the time you get to deployment, you're pretty calloused, and you're ready for live fire situations. And you think that, and then you land on the tarmac in Kandahar, and it's January, and it was -40 in Fort Drum when you left. And you can feel the heat coming off the skin of the C-130 when you're landing, because it's so hot in Kandahar, Afghanistan in January. And you're at altitude, but that's irrelevant. But as soon as that back door goes down and the heat floods the plane, and you look around and you realize you're standing in the middle of the desert, and you got some stuff to move with a flak jacket on, and the whole deal. Even as prepared as we are, everybody had that moment of soaking it in and realizing, okay, this isn't a training exercise. This is real, and it's time to lock in. Because in our world of infantry, lives are on the line every moment that you're doing your job. And so, very much like an athlete, when it's time to get on the mat, the field, the pitcher's mound, whatever it may be, you got to lock in and perform. And there's no option in Afghanistan but to lock in and perform, or the consequences of not doing that are pretty severe.
Yeah, I mean, Matt and I will never be able to kind of understand,
No.
the chips that were on the table for you and your squad, your infantry. So one, thank you for your service, and two, like that mindset. Obviously, I can see has translated to a lot of the conversations that you and I have had about performance coaching and about your goals and aspirations. But now going from military and then, like you said, transitioning back to everyday life, getting a job, being a civilian again. How was that transition, one, for you, and that mentality and mindset that you've carried over? How do you maintain that, knowing now, you're back working, just for a lack of a better usage of words, like it's a more content lifestyle, obviously, once you come back and you are home, you're comfortable. How do you maintain that level of intensity that you've maintained and kind of held throughout your professional career?
I think you find a lot of us. I can't speak for everybody. I can only speak for myself. But I think you find an outlet, and there's a lot of mental health considerations for folks transitioning out of the military in general, but then you add combat arms folks who may be exposed to things that are a little bit more harsh.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other layer of consideration. So, that's a pretty heavy topic. And so I'll probably just kind of leave that alone. But say that it was just to be completely above board is definitely a part of my journey is making sure that those things are addressed, so that part of being your best is I guess for me has been acknowledging the past, understanding that it is the past. It helped shape who I am, but I'm okay with leaving it where it is and moving forward and growing forward. But it took some work to get to that point, right? And so that's part of the journey. The other part of the journey is, it's crazy, but it's true. I went from a very high performance, don't ask questions, follow orders. As long as it's a lawful order, you move forward, you do what you got to do, to my first job coming out of the military was Stryker, Puerto Rico. I moved to Puerto Rico, took my family, wife was pregnant, we found out. And so, moved to Puerto Rico, took a great job, learned a lot with, a great company, but Puerto Ricans are incredibly sensitive, and it's a great thing. It's a great trait of their culture. I was not sensitive at all. And I needed to figure out the emotional intelligence aspect of transitioning from an environment where emotional intelligence is optional to an environment where emotional intelligence is first. It's how business is done. You must have a relationship and trust of your coworker, especially if you're a gringo, in order to get things done. So honestly, I have to give a lot of credit to the Puerto Rican people for helping me and planting that seed, maybe that spark for me that was the catalyst to help me begin to develop emotional intelligence and become aware that it was a necessary part of transitioning and then being successful in life, is learning how to deal well with others.
Yeah. Thank you again for sharing that. I know a big piece of your life, and again, thank you for your service, because I know that's extremely important. And then moving next into, right, you talked about working for a new company in Puerto Rico, and then, like you said, you have 20 years in medical device sales experience. And then, like you said earlier, you kind of dipped your toes in sport throughout the whole time while you're working.
Yeah.
So you said both judo, jujitsu, and golf. So
Mhm.
now, from the outside looking in, jujitsu, judo versus golf, very different opposite ends of the spectrum. I'm sure there's not much overlap there for a lot of people, but seemingly you're dipping your toes in both. How did you approach both mentally? With they're such different games. One is grappling and not necessarily being aggressive, but you're in that moment versus me versus you, where golf is a little bit more you versus you. There's really no one on one. It's kind of you in your own head. How did you navigate, going from jujitsu and judo and then playing golf and kind of focusing on that and excelling in that?
Yeah, so wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu, golf, there's something they all have in common. They're individual sports. And
Mm-hmm.
wrestling where I started and judo where I started, it's you versus one other person. Golf is often discussed in the context of you versus your opponent or a field. It's really not. It's you versus the golf course. And I can connect with that and ignore whoever I'm playing with and understand that my opponent is the golf course. And my job is to figure out how to cripple and beat my opponent. And so I think taking the same lessons that I learned of, heck, my high school wrestling team, we ended every single practice saying never give up, never give up, never, never, never. If you ask anybody who plays golf with me about my golf game, I might be in the trees and it looks like I hit a bad drive, and I did, but all of a sudden I'm back in right back in position and on where I should be, and I think that comes from wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu, that mental resiliency. It's built into the sport because it's a physical sport, and if you're not able to withstand, anybody who starts out in jiu-jitsu will tell you it's brutal being a new white belt in a room of brown belts and black belts and purple belts. You pretty much are, it's a legal fight. You're getting your butt kicked. And it's not fun, and a lot of people can't withstand that. And if you do that for decades, let's see, 30, was my math right? Yeah, 32 years, almost 33 years of grappling. You can see the ear. Um, you generate resiliency from your environment, or the environment will break you. And so I've been fortunate enough to be able to adjust to that environment, and then that translates to the military. That translates to being able to get through business school at a top 5 business school while being a full-time employee with your wife, an undergrad, and a baby. Like it's the ability to do that stuff because you could withstand the butt kicking that you took early in judo and jiu-jitsu and wrestling, and know that if you keep applying yourself and you keep following the process and create a process with meaningful outcomes associated with it, you can do anything.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I feel like, one, you mentioned hitting the ball in the tree and then getting yourself out. If it was me, I'm just staying in the tree. I'm not getting myself out. But but one day I'll get there. But you talked about the mental resiliency in both or in all judo, jujitsu, golf, and then now coming full circle back to performance coaching, right? I think a lot of the conversations that Matt and I have had on this podcast and with the guests that we've had all circle around, no matter what the sport is, mental resiliency, and kind of going over that conversation and what is that, how do we get there, etc. So now my question for you is, coming full circle back from your introduction, you get into performance coaching, right? Can you give, everyone kind of explains it a little bit differently. I don't think we've explained it on the podcast, but can you give your like 1 sentence, 2 sentence spiel about what performance coaching is to you? Because I feel like everyone kind of has a different lens on what it means and how it helps athletes.
Well, performance coaching in and of itself is unique in that it's a skill set, it's a framework that can be applied in a lot of different disciplines. It's under the category technically of life coach, but it's a specialty. And the difference being we are very much focused on what you might consider, some people call them some high performance coach. But the idea is that we're creating outcomes that require an individual to push beyond what would be considered your comfort zone and grow and expand. And we help them create plans, strategies, metrics, accountability partners, whatever it's needed, and then install that into their life via process and automation. And then that process will fuel them day after day after day after day, consistency, the law of accumulation. And they'll eventually reach things that they wouldn't have otherwise because they had somebody helping them better understand where they want to take their life, and then developing the strategies alongside them, and then helping them install those strategies into their life with, meaningful oversight, measurement. I say measure, fine tune, perform, repeat, right? It's kind of the idea.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think we haven't really talked about performance coaching at all, but Matt and I have had conversations on the side about kind of what that is. But Matt, you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's great. I think, a lot of performance coaches, like, you have to have that ability to overcome that natural resiliency and everything. So I think, one question that most people might ask to a performance coach, kind of, chair opposite from them, be like, how do you overcome, right? Like, what are some key principles that kind of help you get over maybe a situation, or what have you kind of done in the past to kind of move forward from different things and, been able to get to your peak?
Sure. It's going to vary by individual, right? And so if you kind of go down the mental pathway, within golf as an example, there's a lot there to chew on. If you go down the strategic pathway, there's a lot there to chew on. So maybe you can maybe just unpack your question one layer deeper, and then that'll help maybe kind of calibrate me a little bit, and then I'll respond, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So I think, let's use golf actually as like an example, right? So like, I keep hitting into the woods, right? And I'm getting down on myself. I'm playing with buddies, and they're hitting into the fairway and everything. And no matter how many lessons I go through, right? I can't get in the fairway like my boys do. And they're shooting, they're shooting really good rounds. I'm shooting terrible rounds, and I'm like, it all starts with the drive. Like, how would you try to, like, what key principles would you try to, give to someone to try to get them? Maybe it might be, self-talk or
Sure.
anything like that to try to get them going in the right direction.
Yeah, so I mean, as an example, in what I would call the mental quadrant, which we'll talk about in a minute, there's a couple things we unpack there. It's pre-shot routine, self-talk, resiliency, and focus. And in the case of what you described, somebody who's getting down on themselves, I have a client like that. He's a 14-year-old, highly competitive, high-ranked golfer. And those moments will happen where he's disappointed with himself on the golf course because he realizes he's capable of more. And so we've done some work on identity. We've done some work on, kind of adopting the 1% mindset and allowing himself room to make mistakes, if you will, hit shots that are less than what he had imagined. And so I think starting with, usually that kind of response, there's something under the surface that's responsible for the charge, because there's energy that's showing up when the athlete is outside of where they expect to be. So I try to kind of like pick at that a little bit up front so that I can kind of understand, not from a psychiatry or anything like that, but like, what's the energy? What's causing that? Is it expectation? Is it a guardian that's involved that's putting too much pressure on the athlete? There's something there that is the spark. And so I try to get to that first to better understand the psychology, the basics under the thought process, what's happening. And when I can understand that and the athlete has expressed that, there's usually also then a heightened sense of self-awareness for the athlete, and what you see is they even start to kind of self-correct. because they're just talking about it makes them aware of it, and they're just not aware of it most of the time. And so you sometimes don't even need to do anything other than discuss it.
Right.
And like, are you aware that after you shanked that you threw your club 44 yards to the left and hit that old lady? Whatever. No, I didn't. I blacked out. I didn't know that happened. Roy McIlroy. Nah, Rory, you just won, so I won't say that, buddy. But I saw that one that he threw out into the lake. That would have hurt somebody. But anyway,
Right.
so kind of starting with, again, what's the underlying issue there? There's a lot there, and it's different for everybody, right? What kind of causes that? Once I understand that, and I understand where they want to go, then we try to create, okay, if you continue to act like this, what's the negative that will come from this? And just have them self-identify. Like a 14, 15, 16-year-old athlete is going to say, my friends are going to think I'm crazy, or they're going to become socially aware because they don't want to be seen as being, a crazy golfer, a crazy athlete, or something like that. And so they just sort of like begin to self-correct. And so I think where you can do that, and you don't even have to really make it uncomfortable because they're self-correcting and adjusting, I think that's best. But then when you take it one step further, as an example, with one other athlete that comes to mind, I'd have them go through when they're driving to the course to do their warm-up to play in the round, they would go through all 18 holes, shot by shot, exactly how they wanted it to happen. And every shot would be planned. They're looking at their yardage book. They're saying, driver, okay, I've got 160 yards left, 8 iron, back right pin. I'm going to be 10 feet back and short to the left. They're going through everything, and they're visualizing it exactly how it's happening. And so what you're doing is you're installing a positive memory, right, of how you want it to happen. And if you associate micro body movements with that positive memory, it actually increases the productivity by over 20%. Swiss study to quote on that. But then, to just wrap it up, to kind of how do you address the negative is you do the opposite of that. You say, okay, now I want you to go through at least one scenario where you're out of position for at least one shot on the hole, and I want to see you showing yourself, visualizing your recovery back into position and scoring. And so, again, that's installing a memory, if you will, by having them visualize it, and it's giving them the confidence that they've been here before and starting to create trust in themselves so that they can have a little bit more of a positive energy, which we'll get into in a minute, versus that stressful negative energy, which is going to propel some of the other things we'll unpack here in a second.
Love that. I'm strapped in. I'm ready to go. That's amazing. I love it.
Thank you for listening to the ARC podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Philly Pretzel Factory of Marlton, located on North Maple Ave in Marlton, New Jersey.
Tell them Matt and Brandon sent you. We appreciate all your support. Thank you for listening, and back to the podcast.
So you alluded to it, and we referenced it at the beginning, where you brought up the mental quadrant.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were referring to that, the overarching lesson there is you came up with your 4 quadrants of golf performance.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is applicable to any sort of sport overall, but obviously you have your quadrants that are specific to golf performance and high-level golf performance. Do you mind sharing with us like that philosophy and kind of going into each quadrant so our audience can identify what that is and what they can work on?
Yeah, and I'll just give props, kind of the origin of this idea and where that seed was planted for me. Rudy Gonzalez is the coach at Texas A&M International, and he's a great coach. He was in the process of recruiting my oldest son to play golf, and he brought it up during a dinner, and we discussed it, and it was like a cockroach, man. It just burrowed in my brain, and I couldn't stop thinking about it because it just changed the way that I looked at golf completely. And then from there, it was like I was in the lab after that. And so another thing that makes me unique is I've coached over 500 competitive rounds of junior golf. And when you do that, you see a lot of things that happen on the course. And so after the meeting with Rudy Gonzalez, the coach at A&M International, I then start looking at these rounds differently through a different set of lenses. And when you do that, you start to see this pattern. And the pattern, I'm generalizing. Of course, everybody is unique. But the general pattern is that you have these athletes who are, 12 to 22 years old, and they're incredible athletes. Golf is not what it used to be. Their physical capabilities are unbelievable. The high school capabilities of a golfer would blow your mind compared to what it maybe used to be 20, 30 years ago. Yeah. These are athletes now. Yeah. So they're often pretty well prepared physically. That's not always the case, obviously. When that's not the case, I'm happy to make that happen. That's easy stuff. But generally speaking, the strategic and the mental quadrants are the quadrants that are underserved. Because what I hear when I'm walking around the course with other athletes and their parents and listening in on those conversations is the conclusion that every athlete, not every, but most of them reach is, I had a bad round, I need to go see my swing coach. And from my perspective, I'm watching going, yeah, you had a bad round, but your swing is the most beautiful swing I've ever seen in my life. And your power is insane. Your physical tools are unbelievable, but your decision-making is trash. And because your decision-making is trash, you're constantly relying on greatness of your physical and technical tools, which are just difficult to repeat. And so that kind of then allowed me to mature the idea of the four quadrants a bit deeper. And as I began to work with athletes, I began to look at what are the predominant themes of, for example, physical that show up in golf. And one of those elements is speed. Okay, well then how can you measure speed? Well, in golf, clubhead speed is generally, referred to as the standard of speed measurement, right? And then you can look at, okay, well, what's the average PGA player's clubhead speed, right? And then if you look at this across all of these different elements and you think of Madden on PlayStation or College Football 25 and you think of a 100-point scale, and that a perfect person, a perfect golfer, Bryson DeChambeau is pretty close, but he's not there yet either, would be a perfect 100, right? There's a couple athletes on Madden that are like 98, 99 rated, something like that, right? That's kind of the idea with the four quadrants is we're looking at it through the lenses of, well, where is the PGA player at? If that's kind of average, then where are we baselining this athlete? And then where are their strengths and weaknesses within the elements of each quadrant? How can we more leverage their strengths and then plan their course management strategy around those strengths and then address their weaknesses within all those, with each of those four quadrants where the elements suggest that they have the greatest opportunity to improve. Looking at it qualitatively and quantitatively where appropriate and where possible, and then beginning to say, okay, for example, somebody presents with essentially no course management rating at all. They have a 0 because they don't have a yardage book, a green book, they don't do practice rounds, etc. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in competitive golf for things like this on the strategic mental side, because there is such an emphasis on the physical and technical side with weightlifting, speed work, technical work with a swing coach. There's a lot of opportunity for golfers in particular to lower their scores by addressing the low-hanging fruit in strategic and mental.
Yeah, that was incredible. So thank you for that deep dive. That was awesome and very thorough. So I think an interesting point that you brought up too was like the self-reflection portion. So like you and I have talked about previously, like you've had clients that you're like, okay, well, what's your let's say preparation score, and they give you something, and then you have some follow-up questions where it's like, well, like, do you play a practice round beforehand? And they're like, no. And it's like, so you gave yourself a 98 on preparation, but you didn't even see the course before you played. I feel like a lot of, especially Matt and I have dealt with youth athletes in baseball. It's like the same thing. It's like, how did you prepare? Oh, I work harder than anyone else. And then it's like, okay, well, how many times this week did you work out? Oh, I don't work out. It's like, oh, okay, interesting. One. And then you keep following up with, again, the strategic and mental side. So when you're working with a client, do you feel like there's a lot of aha moments during that self-reflection? Because I mean, for Matt and I, listen, I'm guilty of, I didn't perform on the mound. What do I think? Physically, I need to go change something. I'm guilty of that. I know Matt's guilty of it. I'm sure a lot of athletes are. So are there a lot of aha moments where it's like, maybe after every time I play a bad round, I don't have to change everything and start from ground zero?
Yeah, so there's a ton of aha moments. So my process, just to kind of give you an insight, is I'm going to give them a TPI, so Titleist Performance Institute screen up front. That's the first thing I do. It's complimentary. I'm going to make sure that I understand how their body is working relative to the golf swing. And from that assessment, once that's done, the client will receive a score. And they're going to receive that information with a TPI, Titleist Performance Institute login on their app. And then from that, we're going to create a custom workout plan specifically based on their assessment, so that whatever their opportunities are for physical improvement in that regard, we address that straight away. Even if they're working with another trainer or they're working with a swing coach, etc., that's okay. We're just going to communicate as a team and communicate the TPI findings, etc., so that we're still honoring the team system. If they're just working with me for all 4 quadrants, which is also common, then we just integrate that into their program. Once we've done that, the TPI initial screen, and then prescribe their standard workout, which addresses sort of the physical and a little bit of the technical, but not completely the technical. I give them a qualitative assessment to respond to, and that's where the aha moments continue, because there's also aha moments in the TPI screen and then that initial workout. They're prescribed things to do that they may have never heard before, because TPI is unique in that regard. So there's going to be some aha moments there where they better understand how their body's functioning from that screen, which, as you know, as athletes, we always want to better understand what's going on with our body so we can maximize performance, right? So then we jump into the qualitative, to your question earlier, with the strategic and the mental, and there are qualitative aspects for physical and technical as well to baseline the conversation. And they'll reply to that questionnaire, and then from that, that's where we start to unpack it, like what you were talking about, right? So one of my questions, I'll just give you an example. So that's how effectively do you plan your approach shot for each hole? This one client responded with an 80. Okay, so take me through your process from you're in the middle of the fairway at the 150 marker, you're in perfect position. Take me through how you plan your approach. If their response is really intelligent and it's informed, and they say things like pin position, and this is the nearest edge to that pin position, and I'm trying to position myself here because of this, this, and this, and they really have a great explanation as to how they're approaching that approach shot, then that score is at least qualitatively validated. Now, during a practice round, if I'm observing them in motion, in nature, where they're intended to be observed, not doing it on a video, but actually going out and spending time with them, then I validate that in reality again, right? Because how an athlete interprets their performance versus how they actually perform, that's why I say I try to do qualitative and quantitative where possible to kind of make this Madden score a little bit more rigorous.
Yeah.
But those are kind of like the approaches and a little bit of a peek behind the curtain into how I go through it.
Yeah, and you talked about the TPI coaching and then obviously the performance coaching side of it. So now you have skill-based coaching and the strategic and mental side of coaching, right? So, one, can you tell me how you're, like, the unique thing that we've talked about with you especially is you have a great background in both, where you have the skills and ability to coach both skill-based and like the strategic and mental side of it. Can you, I guess, go into like your approach as the coach, how you approach skill-based coaching versus the mental and strategic? Because like Matt and I have a background in skill-based coaching, giving lessons, the whole 9 yards for as far as the baseball side goes. I'm diving into obviously the strategic and mental side of coaching a little bit more. Matt obviously has an interest in it. So can you kind of talk about like the skill-based side versus the mental performance-based side?
Yeah, so pretty much 100% of my clients have one goal, and it's to lower their scores and to earn a Division I scholarship or to be a professional golfer. So I just think of that goal. That's usually what they tell me, right? Like we talk about goal setting. It's the first thing you talk about as a performance coach is what are you trying to accomplish, where are you trying to go. So let's understand the why and make sure that we first understand the why, and then that gives us the ability to anchor everything else back to that very strong why, which is going to be the gasoline on our fire that we need to make it happen. But then I'm going to go back to my assessment, my onboarding tools, where I'm evaluating the athlete initially, both physical, technical, strategic, mental. If my goal is to lower score, right, then the underlying task for me as a performance coach is to collaborate with the athlete to identify where the greatest opportunity to lower score is. And so to do that, I first need to understand the athlete as a whole, which is why the 4 quadrants approach is so important, right? It gives me insights into the entirety of the athlete so that if we're trying to make a NASCAR go faster, from an engineering perspective, we need to understand what's causing drag, what's the weight, what's the engine output, what's the torque, blah, 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 blah. We're doing the same thing. We're trying to engineer an athlete for elite performance, right? And so start with the end in mind, understand the components that will allow an athlete to graduate to elite performance, and then you start breaking it down into day-to-day habits. And depending on the athlete, again, most junior athletes are going to have more upside for me in the strategic and the mental side. And so just to talk to the strategic side, that one goes pretty deep in that the strategic side really can come down to installing the right processes and the right tools. And a lot of golfers haven't been just instructed on kind of like what you would see a PGA golfer go through to get ready to compete week over week and all the things that go into it. We just see the end product on TV on Sunday afternoon after church with a beer in your hand, and you think, man. But those guys and the amount of work that a professional golfer goes through in order to produce that outcome is mind-boggling. That's why there's like 120 something on PGA Tour, right? It's a percentage of a percentage of a percentage of people who can do this. And so if that's your goal, you have to be eyes wide open. And again, that's why it's so important to baseline the Madden score on, well, this is what the average PGA player's score is. This is where you are. We have to deal with reality at some point. Yep. Because if you don't benchmark and deal with reality, then you'll never have the client's permission to build the bridges that will allow them to reach that level, right? They have to be bought in and understand all the things that go into that. So my approach then is generally going to be these kids are physical, technical geniuses for the most part. Turn the dial slightly there for most of them, and they're going to be wonderful physically and technically. Lean into the strategic elements like course management, like distance control, like course reconnaissance, like environmental adjustments. Create standardized process for each of those elements, just like a PGA player would go through. And now, just to be clear, every PGA player's preparation is different, right? And so as a performance coach, I'm not prescriptive. I'm not saying that the elements I referenced are absolute. They're going to be a little bit different for every athlete. In order to get their MAD score as high as possible, we're going to work on certain things, and we're going to leave certain things alone because they're already exceptionally fantastic, right? I don't know if I've answered your question or if I've gone off into the rough.
You did. You definitely did. But I think at the end there, you referenced something really important, and I think it should be talked about more, where I feel like on the physical side now, a lot of either lifting programs, a lot of skill-based programs are getting a lot more individualistic. Now, historically, whenever, I've kind of researched about mental preparation years ago, especially when I played, they reference this is the way you have to do it. It's very like this is the template, this is what you do. The way that you're talking about it is very individualistic, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's extremely important because one, what drives me versus what drives Matt is going to be completely different. So can you talk to that just a little bit more? And like, yeah. I'm sure you have examples and you've seen it. Like individually, can you just give maybe an example of how you would go about an approach for one person mentally or strategically versus another?
Yeah. You know, you need to first get to know the athlete a little bit to understand what they're going through. But the unique thing about performance coaching and why performance coaching can be so impactful is I only work with 20 clients at a time.
Yeah.
Period. That's it. So you're thinking a lot more about that problem of how do I lower this person's score. And so again, it's important to stress that you're not just taking somebody and dumping them into a predetermined process and saying, here's the formula, everybody throws the ball this way, everybody swings the golf club this way. TPI is very much about this. I'm very much about this. It's understanding where the athlete is naturally great.
Yeah.
And dumping fuel on that fire as much as possible. One of my kiddos, the kid can putt in any, doesn't matter. He's just gonna, he's gonna drain the putts. He just has it. Some days his driver could be dope, hitting it down the center, and the next day it could be in the pond because he's so frustrated he doesn't know where it's going, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So on the physical side, that's easy, right? Is we see that as a pattern because we start to look at metrics like fairways hit. We look at something called opposite of pin, OP, which is a strategic positioning in the fairway, or kind of helps you approach things like this. And then from that, we gain insights through the data, right? So all my players have a custom scorecard that they record during the round, so we can begin to then evaluate the feedback that's being provided on the course, and then again create a custom plan based on what we're seeing, whether it's a physical or a strategic or a technical issue. So with the kiddo who had the driving issue, his mental resiliency was phenomenal.
Yeah.
He didn't allow it to upset him at all. And so the mental side, he was actually really good. Comes from a household with modest expectations, no crazy pressure. He's free to just kind of be himself, do his thing. So for him, it was really just a physical issue where he actually had like a spine angle and a weight transfer issue that wasn't present on his irons and his wedges, and it was present on his driver because he was trying to swing his driver like a wedge or an iron, and they're different swings. So once he got that sorted out, then he started to see momentum, and he was an exception in that he actually did have a physical issue. The kiddo who had very poor mental resiliency, this kid was in first place in a tournament and got to the 18th hole up by 1, airmailed the green, plugged in the bunker, no good options, just a really nasty situation. And the best he could do was hit it out of the bunker across the green to the other side of the green, and then try to get up and down from there, and he didn't. And he was upset, and he lost the tournament. He didn't win the tournament anyway. So, but those are opportunities. Those moments, as much as they're painful for the athlete, the best work is done when the athlete's clear-minded because they're feeling pain and they're not clouded by their success, right? They're willing to do what's needed in that moment. That's the moment to strike. Now, you can't do it when they're walking off the 18th green and they're upset. You got to give them some space, let them cool down a bit, off gas, whatever you want to call it. But then come back to it and use that pain as a resource to help, redirect and identify that as a source, right? And since then, by the way, that athlete I mentioned, it's like God had a plan, I don't know, put him in the exact same situation in a tournament that was the last tournament of the fall. This was the first tournament in the spring. So we had a couple months to stew on it over Christmas break. And then he goes out to the first tournament of the year, and he's presented with the same situation on like the sixth hole. Makes a bogey. Well, guess what? He made a birdie after that bogey, which from, if you listen to Tiger Woods or anybody talk about bounce back birdies, super important. And it was also a demonstration of resiliency in that he didn't allow that moment to take it over. He was able to maintain, his physical, his technical, all his quadrants remained sort of optimized and performing. He didn't compromise it by getting pissed off, getting tense, which again, great story with that specific athlete because it started with pain, but that pain was the catalyst for growth, and because we were able to capture that moment and take advantage of it.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. What are some of the differences, right? So like we kind of talked with golf. I know you touched upon like jiu-jitsu and everything like that. What are some of the similarities and some of the differences between, obviously they're two different sports, but those types of athletes and everything?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you were to break down jiu-jitsu into the four quadrants, strategic, mental, physical, technical, it's very applicable. And how the athletes, but the elements that build up the athlete is a little bit different, right? So, for example, in golf, every course, every shot is technically different. So course management under the strategic quadrant is very important. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, if you were talking to like Jan, who's one of my instructors, who's currently the second-ranked adult black belt in the world, he would tell you, depending on who he's fighting against, he's going to use certain techniques, right? Because they have these tendencies on video. They do these certain things, these guard pulls, these takedowns, whatever it may be. He already has in mind strategically the type of match, the type of fight he wants to bring to his opponent. And so the strategic elements are a little bit different, right, with something like jiu-jitsu, but there's still very much a strategic element. Now, I would argue that the mental elements of jiu-jitsu and golf are quite similar in that in golf you're often faced with adversity and you need to make an adjustment, kind of recover, if you will. And when you see an athlete recover and get past adversity, it often creates momentum. In a golf setting where somebody will make a hard par, something frees them up about it, and all of a sudden they go on a birdie run, and what started it was a hard par that they had to grind out, but it freed them up for some reason. You see that also in jiu-jitsu at times where somebody will hit something and it gives them the confidence and it frees them up and they continue, and you see that momentum. But you also see where people will get in trouble, they recover from something, right? Maybe they've been taken down, but then they recover into guard and they hit a submission from their favorite guard position or whatever, or they hit a sweep and they get into mount and they kind of turn the match, right? And so that ability to overcome adversity on the mental side, the resiliency, if you will, the positive self-talk, right, too, because you don't really have too much time to think in jiu-jitsu, so this would be one of the key differences. So I'm rambling, but I'll get to one of the key differences here. Golf, you have about 5 to 7 minutes between shots to think. This is a big problem for some golfers.
Yeah.
Because they don't do very well transitioning from the rational thinking, even emotional mind, to the athletic mind. Whereas baseball, you're getting a pitch, you got to see it and hit it, right? Golf, you have a lot of time to think. And sometimes that's detrimental to athletes because they think too much and they kind of overboard in that regard. Well, jiu-jitsu, if you start thinking, as my sensei Leo would say, if you think, you're already late, right? You have to react. And so on the mental side in jiu-jitsu and wrestling and judo, it's much more like baseball in a lot of ways in that it's reactionary, at least from a pitching and a batting perspective. Maybe not standing in center field for 15 minutes between innings and not doing anything. But yeah.
That's awesome. I love that saying, like, if you think you're late. I know we talk a lot about baseball in this podcast and everything, and it's just like if you're a hitter and you're like thinking up there, like you're trying to place a shot, like you're late. It's not gonna happen. You're either doors, it's blown by it, or you're getting it. I love that analogy. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a cool perspective that you just shined a light to that Matt and I have talked about a little bit, where you said like the resiliency itself, overcoming something, can build enough momentum to get you to where you want to be. And I feel like when you see it from that lens, it's like you can see failure almost as, obviously it's never going to be exciting, but it's like, okay, how do I bounce back from this? Because when I do bounce back from this, I'm going to be unstoppable. It's like it gives you the confidence to build into what you need to be. And I feel like in golf, jiu-jitsu, baseball, football, any sport that you're going to play, that's ultimately what's going to be most important. It's not how you perform when you're doing your best. It's when your back's against the wall, how are you going to respond, and then how are you going to, continue after you make that response. So thank you for shedding that light, because I feel like that's extremely important.
Yeah, it's well said. Thank you.
And then I guess one last question for you now, as a performance coach that's had your experience now in the field, and you're working with clients now, and you're coming up with these strategies in order to get a lot of people better. Now, what motivates you personally, and what are your goals moving forward for not just you, but Performance Juice as a whole?
It's called elite performance coaching for a reason, and it's to produce elite athletes. At the end of the day, that's my sole mission. Anybody that wants to lower their score, I'm fully committed to that as their performance coach. So it's pretty simple. It's a very focused mission, and I'm going to keep finding the best partners. I'm going to keep finding the best methods, the best tools, in order to help each of those 4 quadrants ultimately reach the highest possible rating. And I believe that when you reach the highest possible rating in each of those 4 quadrants, you have the greatest potential to perform at the absolute highest level.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And I know, just knowing you and having the conversations that we've had, you're going to be ultra successful in the way that you do this, because your message and the way that you go about this is extremely motivating, extremely helpful, very dedicated, and very calculated. So we appreciate you coming on and kind of sharing all this. And I mean, I learned a lot, and obviously you and I talk frequently, so I still learned a bunch today, and I'm sure Matt did too. So thank you for coming on. Give Drew a follow on Instagram, at Performance Juice. He's posting stuff all the time. He's posting good knowledge nuggets on there. So go on, give him a follow, and yeah, thanks for coming on, Drew.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys. Appreciate you spending a little time with me.
Of course. Awesome. Thank you.